Okay, the next project we're going to talk about is, we've talked about using brush. This one has to do with enhancing the habitat through using aquatic vegetation. The guy that was supposed to come today and help me, or I asked him to come, was Dave Jakubowski. He's with TABC, or had been at one time, and he's been, this is him bending over here, he's been a great volunteer and has always been there on several different projects for us. He's lives up on Lake LBJ. Hello, guy. Lake LBJ, if you're not familiar with it, at one time back in the 60s, it was considered one of the best bass fisheries in Texas. In the 60s, it had high aquatic vegetation coverage, even to the point that it was considered a nuisance. About the late 60s or early 70s, the lake was drawn down, probably to get, I don't know exactly why, probably to get rid of a lot of the aquatic vegetation that was in there that was causing problems. And since that time, it's really not come back. This is about a 6,000 acre reservoir. And one of the things you'll notice from the aerial here is how developed it is. These are all homes around the lake. This is one of the first lakes on the Highland Lake chain of lakes that was developed. Kind of the issue here is that waterfront development has reduced the shoreline habitat. In 2001, it was about 57% bulkheaded, and it continues to be bulkheaded as they develop more of the shoreline. So there's very little natural shoreline. Large areas of the reservoir are devoid of aquatic vegetation, and a lot of the reservoir too has this filamentous algae that grows on the bottom. You can't even fish a bottom bumping bait because your hook just fills with this filamentous algae. So it's got some other issues. Typically, what they'll do up here is when they develop a home, you can see there's some aquatic vegetation. This is Wildwill along the bank, but then to make it nice and neat, they typically put in a retaining wall like this. Looking at a study from Minnesota, they found a 66% reduction in floating leaf and emergent aquatic vegetation associated with shoreline development. So this, typically, when you develop a shoreline, it's going to have an effect on what's in the shallow water next to it. This is kind of an example. You can see this is an undeveloped lot here, and you've got two boathouses, one on each side. You've got vegetation in here, and then there's nothing on the other side. In 2009, the EPA put out the National Lakes Assessment, and they concluded that degraded shoreline habitat was the most significant of the problems assessed. So looking at all the different problems we have on our reservoirs, this degradation of the shoreline was the most significant problem. This is typical of what happens up there. This is, I think they're putting a golf course in here. You can see the erosion. And there's no buffer zone between the shoreline with anything to stop it. They put in some silt fences, as you can see here and here, but they've been completely bowled over by the erosion. This has a large effect on shoreline vegetation. So the goal of our project was to improve shallow water habitat and fishing for cover-seeking species by introducing native aquatic vegetation, with an objective of not just putting the vegetation in and hoping that it would stay in the place where we put it, but that the vegetation would expand. We would provide the founder colonies, and the vegetation would expand to other areas of the reservoir, either through fragmentation, through the root system growing out to different places, or so on. We know that vegetation, it's good for habitat. It's good for fish. The old saying, grass equals bass, I think really, there is something to that. A lot of our best bass lakes have aquatic vegetation in it. Bass love it, and that's the reason that it's so important. So we did a cooperative effort, and this involved a bunch of different agencies and so on: Parks and Wildlife, Lower Colorado River Authority, Corps of Engineers, and then we had a group of volunteers. The Lake LBJ Fish and Habitat Committee. This was started in 2000. Introduced 9 species of native plants, some submerged, some emergent, some floating leaf. Protected the plants from herbivory. We used cage material to keep turtles, carp, deer, that kind of thing from eating them. We also used some transplants from other parts of the reservoir. The lower part of LBJ does have, and throughout the lake it has this, it has Wildwill, which is it's an emergent plant that grows in shallow water. On the Coosa River in Alabama, they actually call it bass grass because the bass really like to get into it. We also use spatterdock, which is it's a lily pad with a yellow flower on it, and that also occurs in the lower end of the reservoir. Looking at the project cost, for this particular project, we spent about $7,000 just in material. A lot of that was we had to purchase the plants from the Corps of Engineers. They were $10 a plant. That added up. And then it was about $8,000 in labor, but about $5,000 of this was a contract labor with the Corps of Engineers. So results, almost all the species did well inside the cages, and I'll show you some examples here in just a second. There was minimal spread outside the cages for the introduced species, the ones that were new to the lake, but the transplants that we moved from one area of the lake to the other did well in the cages, and they also spread outside the cages and did provide some additional habitat. This is kind of a typical deal here, pretty impressive. This is eelgrass in here, and this is American or Illinois pondweed over here. You can see completely filled the inside of the cages, but did not spread outside. And probably herbivory has something to do with that. The plants, once they get outside the cages, they get eaten by turtles, carp, whatever. And they just, the introduced species really never spread. One of the plants we did have good success with was water willow, and this is the one that I'll talk a little bit about. We transplanted this. This was a plant that you could pick this up. You could actually pluck it out of the sediment. It comes out with the root structure. And we put this in 5-gallon buckets and pick it up and move it to other places. Just put it into the substrate, and it seems to do real well. The other one was the cow lily. It has this yellow flower on it. And this is another one. It's probably herbivory resistant, and that's the reason it does well in LBJ. So this is a kind of an example of a site. This is a site that we did up in the river portion of Lake LBJ. This is a shoreline fence area. We used a shoreline fence, and then inside the fence we used some additional protection for the plants. And this is about a 1/4 acre site. And this was some water willow that was just put, one row of water willow. This is about 1 year after we put it in. A couple years later, you can see it has started to spread. And you can start to see the cow lily out here has started to spread out. And then in 2008, we went back to cages completely full, and it's moved outside the cage. You can see some of the new colonies of water willow up here outside the cage that have moved out, and your water lily that have moved out here into the steeper water. There's a nice creek channel that runs right in here, and this is right along the edge of the creek channel, so a great place for the fish. Another site, this was a barren shoreline. This is about 1 year after planting. And you can see there it's filled in very nicely and provided some additional habitat. So in summary, the transplants seem to show promise for improving habitat. The other plants we didn't have as much luck with. Some of the other projects that have gone on like this, I think other people in the state have had better luck with the introduced plants than we had. I feel that plantings on a much larger scale could provide additional habitat for Lake LBJ. We've always thought that some type of adopted cove program or a bass club or a group or whatever takes responsibility for one cove, and we need to provide the plants and some of the cage material, and then they would go out and actually do the work. Could be effective at doing this on a much larger scale, and where we could actually have a reservoir-wide effect on habitat, instead of just a small kind of pilot project that we did here. And I don't think it would cost you as much as the project did here if we could provide the plants. But one of the main things is we need a volunteer labor force to do these projects, as I said, and or a cheap source of plants for doing it. At $10 a plant, it adds up pretty quickly. And that's it. Thank you.